It was the night of August 16th, 1947. In a smoke-filled room in Delhi, the clatter of typewriters filled the tense air. This was the office of the Boundary Commission, where the fate of millions was being decided. India was on the verge of being split into two nations, India and Pakistan, but no one truly grasped the immense human cost that was about to unfold. At the center of it all was Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never set foot in India before. He was given just 5 weeks to draw the lines that would divide a subcontinent. Every stroke of his pen had the power to uproot entire families, sever communities, and erase villages from the map. His advisors whispered arguments about rivers, railways, and religious demographics, debating the percentages of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs in each district. The lives of millions hung in the balance, dependent on decisions made with barely enough time to think. When Radcliffe started mapping out the Punjab region, the tension skyrocketed. Here, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived together for generations, often in the very same villages, sharing streets, markets, and fields. A single line drawn in the wrong place could force entire communities to flee their ancestral homes. Outside his window, rivers flowed peacefully, fields were lush and green, and vibrant markets buzzed with life, all oblivious to the impending disaster. But inside each movement of Radcliffe's pen was a life-or-death sentence for thousands. His advisors tried to steer him, but the sheer scale of the task was overwhelming. The clock was ticking relentlessly, and the weight of history pressed down on his shoulders. By August 17th, most of the borders were drawn. The signed maps were final. These lines on paper would now dictate who could stay and who had to leave. And so it began. Trains, soon to be known as death trains, started carrying millions of people toward unknown futures. Families were forced to abandon their homes with only what they could carry. The roads became clogged with a desperate tide of humanity, and bustling markets fell silent, their stalls emptied overnight. Women and children were especially vulnerable, facing unspeakable violence along the treacherous journey. Entire fields and villages were deserted, seemingly in the blink of an eye. What had started as lines on a map triggered the largest mass migration in human history. Shortly after finishing his task, Cyril Radcliffe left India, never to return. He learned of the cataclysm he had helped create through newspapers and official reports. The reality was far worse than anyone had imagined. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the ensuing violence. Over 10 million were displaced, forced to become refugees in their own land. Families were torn apart, many separated forever. Entire towns and communities that had existed for centuries simply vanished or were forced to relocate. A generation of children would grow up surrounded by fear, loss, and the haunting memories of a home they could never go back to. The consequences of those 5 weeks of map-making far exceeded any forecast or report. The migration continued for months, a relentless tide of human suffering. Refugees faced starvation, rampant disease, and the constant threat of violence. The roads and even the rivers overflowed with people on the move. Women were attacked and abducted. Men fought desperately to protect their families and find a safe place to rest. Temporary refugee camps, meant to be short-term shelters, became permanent homes for countless displaced souls. In the midst of this chaos, communities tried to rebuild. Markets slowly reappeared, and makeshift schools were set up, but every single step of the journey was a battle for survival. The political impact was immediate and chaotic. The newly formed governments of India and Pakistan struggled to manage the porous borders and the overwhelming influx of refugees. Railway lines and road networks had to be completely reorganized to support the mass movement of people. Military forces were deployed not for war, but to try and maintain some semblance of order amid the mayhem. International aid organizations offered what little help they could, but it was a drop in the ocean. Disease and hunger continued to claim lives long after the initial violence had subsided, as new policies were drafted to deal with abandoned property and the resettlement of millions. The cultural consequences were just as severe. Sacred temples, mosques, and shrines, places of worship for centuries, were abandoned or destroyed in the frenzy. Languages, dialects, and local traditions were lost or forever transformed as communities were scattered, but memory survived. The trauma of the partition was preserved in songs, poems, and stories. Families passed down tales of loss and survival to their children and grandchildren. In the face of unimaginable hardship, children learned resilience. Displaced communities adapted, finding their footing in new towns and cities, their shared history of trauma and hope forever intertwined. The ripple effects of the partition spread far beyond the new borders. Territorial disputes, many of which continue to this day, flared up almost immediately. Political leaders on both sides used the lingering wounds of partition to fuel their agendas, and military readiness became a national priority. Old local agreements between communities had to be constantly revisited and renegotiated. Families found themselves divided by arbitrary lines on a map, unable to see loved ones just a few miles away. The geopolitical consequences of Radcliffe as map have shaped the Indian subcontinent for decades and continue to define its present. Historians have long debated Cyril Radcliffe's role and responsibility. Some see him as the primary architect of the tragedy, a man who drew lines with callous indifference. Others argue he was simply a bureaucrat executing orders, a cog in a much larger machine of imperial withdrawal. Questions of justice and fairness were raised again and again, but no answer could undo the suffering. Researchers have pored over his letters, maps, and reports, trying to understand the logic behind his decisions. But no policy, no historical analysis, could ever reverse the permanent changes to millions of lives, homes, and communities. The human cost remains staggering and undeniable. That night in 1947 serves as a powerful reminder of how a single action can reshape the destiny of millions. One man with one pen made a series of decisions that altered the course of history. In an instant, communities, families, and the very identity of two nations were transformed. Borders that were drawn on paper became stark realities, defining not just land, but culture, identity, and belonging. What began as a seemingly administrative task spiraled into one of the greatest human tragedies of the 20th century. It shows us that history is not only shaped on dramatic battlefields, but also in quiet rooms where decisions made in haste can echo for generations. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world.